They continue to have bureaucratic hurdles such as long application cycles, unclear eligibility criteria, and top-down design, which mean that they rarely get to the communities that need it the most, and that the ones that are doing the work on the ground, such as women-led organizations, youth networks, indigenous leaders, and civil society coalitions. So today we're really focused on what I call the 4D framework, which is moving from diagnosis to direction to delivery. And none of this happens if we do not have dialogue at every step of the process. And it is rooted in this belief that direction without delivery is truly intention, and that just having the problem is not enough, and that all these steps without dialogue, which is what we're here to do as well, won't truly create that inclusive and sustainable change. So we have a phenomenal panel of experts who will help us through having very informative discussions on policy shifts and collaborative approaches that prioritize direct access to funding for at-risk communities, scalable, inclusive solutions that go beyond pilots, and the political courage it takes to reorient global finance toward prevention, preparedness, and resilience. So very briefly, I'm going to introduce our panel. We have Steve Goldfish, with the Senior Disaster Risk Management Specialist with the Asian Development Bank, Sarah Hoflich, Assistant Secretary General at the United Cities and Local Governments. We have Marcos Concepcion Raba, who's the Executive Director at the Global Network of Civil Society Organizations for Disaster Reduction, and Michelle Chibunga, the CEO for Global Policy House, and last but not least, Emma Haidt with Impact Sync and UNDRR Investor Advisory Board. So we'll continue to have, an engagement from the audience. We'll be using Slido later on, and some questions from the audience as well. And to really kick us off, I want to invite Tanzir Hossain to provide some remarks about what's at stake. He is the chair of the stakeholder engagement mechanism, and he's going to provide a few remarks on how we can continue to move forward together. Tanzir?
Working. Okay, it's working. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me. Give you an anecdote. 1/3 of my yearly time goes into responding to crisis, from the Horn of Africa to the Turkish Syria earthquake, to flood in my country, and earthquake in Nepal or even Indonesia. When we talk about the amount of money we spend responding, and it's not just about money, the suffering of the people is often overlooked. So when the panel will be speaking about it, when we talk about disaster preparedness, the question then comes into my mind is, what happened to us, what has been happening, that we let all these people suffer millions and millions, knowing that we have the money to pre-finance and stop these disasters from happening? Is it us? Is it the system? But then again, it's us who's creating the system. So if you can reflect on what is wrong with the system today, or what is not going right, and how can we really break it down from the point of people, those who are in the forefront. And the second thing I want to say, even if you have all the money, everything, how can community, who are at the forefront of the disaster, can make the decision? How can we, not just delivering money, how do we shift power along with the money? They can make a decision on how they want to prepare for. With that, over to you, Camila. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanzir. Yes, please give it up for Tanzir. Thank you so much for really giving us a little bit of, level setting and what we're talking about, and we had an earlier session on financing as well, and really emphasizing that whole of society approach and understanding that there is no one-size-fits-all approach, right? Every community is different. Every member is important to bring and to really have those mutually beneficial partnerships. We'll continue to talk about different funding mechanisms that will help. So we're going to move into our panel, and I ask our panelists to provide 4 to 5 minute intervention on a case study or insight that they would like to share with you all that provides some examples on how can finance impact DRR initiatives in a way that are inclusive and effective to reach the communities that need it the most. So I'm going to start with you, Steve.
Great. Thanks, Camilla. And it's great to join the panel. Just reflecting on what Tangier was just saying, the need to spend less on recovery, response, and more on risk reduction. So I'm going to give 2 examples from the Asia-Pacific region, one at the national level and one at the community level. And these examples aren't new, and I think that's important, and we can reflect on that a little bit towards the end. So within ADB's member countries, we're seeing, from a financing perspective, a genuine shift from a reactive ex-post orientation to one that's really about decentralizing efforts on DRM. And I think the problem we're seeing is that while it's relatively easy to have that decentralization, moving functions from the center to the subnational governments, state governments, whatever it is, down to the lower levels, administratively speaking, we're not seeing the finance follow. So, the responsibility is there, but the money's not coming with that. And I think this is particularly problematic. So in terms of looking at some good practices, one example I wanted to share was in Pakistan, and this is not, as I said, this is not a new example. So the National Disaster Risk Reduction Fund in Pakistan was established in 2016. The fund is structured as a non-profit government-owned company, and essentially it finances up to 70% of projects that will enhance Pakistan's resilience to natural hazards. So it's very much about investing in disaster risk reduction and preparedness with high economic benefits. So what that looks like is projects that are really addressing hazards, so flood protection structures, rehabilitation, erosion protection, water conservation structures, land stabilization to prevent landslides, and retrofitting of public buildings for seismic risk. So the provincial government put in 30%, and then 70% comes from the centre. So you see that incentive approach there. ADB capitalised the fund back when it was established with a $200 million loan. 100 million of that went into an endowment so that there's an income stream to sustain the operations of the fund over the long term. And then I believe grants were since provided by Australia, Norway, and Switzerland. So the fund has had around a 420 million portfolio. I'm not going to suggest that there haven't been challenges with establishing a national disaster risk management fund. I think there have been, but I think the model itself provides a very useful approach for other countries to consider. Particularly when you're thinking, when it's placed in a wider disaster risk financing strategy, right? So it's not just one piece, but really how do you incentivize preparedness by linking finance to risk reduction outcomes? And that's what they've done here. So finding that vehicle, that model, such as the 70-30 split I was referring to, has seen investments take place that wouldn't have been invested otherwise, right? And this really provides also a structure for the monitoring and reporting. It encourages other partners to invest, and that's what we've seen in Pakistan. The other, and the approach from the Pakistan example can also augment other regular budgetary efforts. And this is where I want to go into the second example, which is from the Philippines. Again, this is not a new example. So this was established in 2010 when the government passed the National Disaster Risk Management Act. And the Philippines have established local disaster risk reduction and management funds. Again, this is about encouraging local governments to invest in disaster risk reduction. And the money is coming from the centre. the local governments are directed to set aside 5% of that budget into a local calamity fund. Then the funds are used both for disaster relief and response, but importantly, there's a direction that 70% of the 5% should be allocated to preparedness and risk reduction measures. So again, neither of these examples are panaceas. It's not as if you just do it and then it's done, but I really think when you place these instruments as part of a wider approach that explicitly considers the role of local government and communities, it does provide not just the responsibility that's coming from the centre, but also the funding. And maybe just to, before I hand it back, just to answer Tangia's question about what's going wrong, and I think generally, you know, we have a lot of emphasis on, from the international community, from the DRM community, about establishing disaster risk management strategies and action plans. And I don't see many of these being costed, right? So it's great to have a plan, but you know, the plan is nothing without money. And we're not, I think as a community, putting as much emphasis on where are your costed plans, where are your investment plans for DRR. When I speak to my climate change colleagues, they're going incrementally with countries and working on climate change investment pipelines. Yes, there are external financing streams through the GCF and others, but majority of that money is coming domestically for most countries. So I think we need to start thinking about how we also focus on funding these plans. Let me hand it back.
Thank you, and I think Emma, you definitely have a lot to say with your remarks here. So I'm going to give you the floor.
We on? Okay. Does it work? Is it on?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be part of this important discussion. So it's not obvious from my title, but I'm in private equity, so my job is entirely private sector financing and working with financing mechanisms that exist within the private sector. And another part of that is the Investment Advisory Board for the UN. So I'm speaking from that point of view. And one of the most persistent problems I see in financing resilience is the fragmentation in the market. So that Camilla has already addressed between private and public and matching global capital with local delivery. I think the capital exists, but it doesn't make its way into resilience in an efficient way, in the way that we would like it to, especially not at a community level where disasters are felt the most strongly. We have seen some promising advancements in nature-based infrastructure. And that's not just a higher? Thank you. And that's not just a green add-on. That is a core component of essential infrastructure. And that's a great example is DC. It's an easy example, but it's available and it worked well. DC had a clean rivers project a few years ago. They had a lot of rain, and that increased rainfall flooded the sewer system and caused a lot of pollution in the rivers surrounding, which was so severe as to impact the quality of life of the people living near those rivers. So they had to do something. So they redesigned the sewer system. And the original proposal was just to use gray infrastructure. So concrete tunnels that would have larger capacity and be able to ship more water out of the city. But a proposal came up, which was actually implemented, which involves natural soil solutions, permeated surfaces or permeable surfaces for drainage, and rain gardens. And what they saw when they put that in place was a sharp decrease in flooding, an increase in biodiversity, and between 200 and 300 million US dollars costs saved. So this has unsurprisingly been replicated many times since, given its success and the cost savings, both in terms of capex and operating costs over the longer term. We see it in London, where Thames Tideway has built in swathes of new parkland in order to increase the drainage and reduce the reduce the strain on the 200-year-old sewer system. We see it in Cape Town, where the watershed restoration increases water security and decreases fire risk. And in Quito, where a municipal water fund finances upstream conservation with a view to safeguarding downstream infrastructure. So these aren't simply environmental solutions or environmental perks. They're critical for the functioning, the development, design, and build of the infrastructure. And I think that we need to start embedding those larger systems. And if we do that, we can protect long-term asset performance and asset value, decrease upfront costs, and as well as operating costs. We can decrease volatility, and we can mitigate the cascading effects, both in terms of the supply chain and in terms of the offtake of the asset. So increase the stability and value of the critical infrastructure. And that is a currency the private sector understands. So from an investment point of view, it's about risk. And the risk is real, it is quantifiable, and it is growing. We see floods hitting power systems. We see heat affecting transmission lines efficiency, and in some instances wiping them out completely, as in Puerto Rico. And we see hurricanes hitting coastal assets. And the bulk of those losses, in many cases, are uninsured. So they hit the bottom line of the essential infrastructure directly. Therefore, disaster risk reduction is not a nice to have. It is an essential part of a good risk-adjusted return profile. So translating resilience into the language of value, I think, is easily done, provided we have the data to do it. Avoided losses are something that can be quantified and modeled early. We have increased credit quality, reducing financing costs, and we have future-proofing of assets, which is critical for many assets which, when they're so embedded in the community, are extremely vulnerable. So, in order to understand the value of resilience, we need data. We need to work out how resilience can translate from a cost in the future to revenue now. And it doesn't translate directly. You have to use some, constructive and creative mechanisms, but with the data, we can model longer term. We can model the cost profile longer term. We can model the disasters, the likelihood of disaster, the impact of disaster. We can model that long term, and then we can match the outgoing expenditure in OpEx in order to be able to ensure that we have the proper resilience measures in place at the point in time at which they are needed. So I think in conclusion, financing, I think the breaking the DRR silos is less about requiring more capital and more about reshaping how we value and finance resilience. And if we can embed that mindset into mainstream investment, then I think we can align long-term private capital with public resilience goals.
Thank you. And I really like both of your points in terms of resilience. And, you talked about, the plan is nothing without money, right? And part of the conversation, and we actually had a session earlier on resilience and investment and innovative financing mechanisms and the role of the private sector. And part of what I was talking about too, which is aligned to what you said, Emma, as well, is I strongly believe that we need to make resilience an investable target, right? How can we make resilience an investable target for communities and for businesses to show that it is good business, right? The ROI, is that mindset of, pay now or pay later type of thing, right? We continue to see how reactive we are, how communities and, across the world, there are different studies that now show that for, $1 that you spend in mitigation preparedness, right? You save now is between $6 to $13 in response and, the economic impact. So the number and the data show that it is important to invest pre-disaster, but we continue to be very, very reactive, right? So I totally agree with you on how do we shift that mindset and continue to reallocate different funding mechanisms. So I'm going to move now to Michelle and provide your remarks as well.
Thanks very much. Afternoon, everybody. I hope we're all feeling great this afternoon. I know it's towards the end of the day, but thank you so much for having me over. I come more from the emerging technology space, so the latest technologies in terms of artificial intelligence, data, blockchain. So a lot of what you've discussed, actually, I think we have the answers, because I do feel that with disaster risk reduction, actually, some of the solutions really sit in being very, very prepared and actually trying to mitigate against the disasters happening in the first place. So I think when you start to leverage what we've seen around the world, actually, is when you start to leverage technology, especially new forms of technology like artificial intelligence, you can predict a lot. And the basis of that really is very much data. Like you've heard, already, data really is the key. Because the more and more data you have, the more you can actually make decisions about what to do and to prepare well in advance. So for me, in terms of actually answering the questions that Tangier, set out for us, around what are we not doing right? What are we not, sort of picking up on? And I think one of the main things really is how we are doing things. I think we need to change. We can't keep doing things the same way like we've always done. We're now in the digital era, right? We are now in a world where, the world is functioning literally almost on a digital platform globally. And what does that mean? I think we also need to shift in terms of our responses towards DRR, and that is really very much leveraging data for sure, but also starting to understand what do these tools, these new tools that we have, when we talk about things like artificial intelligence models, what does that actually mean? It's not just about ChatGPT. I hate to break it to everybody. It isn't. So, at the end of the day, I think, a lot of local governments, I'm sure we've got a lot of local government here. Most governments around the world hold a lot of data, right? And how that data is sitting, whether it's in paper form or whatever it is, it needs to be digitized so that we can start to utilize that data to give us some information and some analytics that we can use to actually plan and predict, and mitigate against disasters coming through. That's number one. Then from a more practical point of view, I think an example I can give from what I've seen, we've been operating across the African continent quite heavily, right? And some of the more emerging markets and least developed economies are actually the ones that feel, they impact the most, they're hit the most. And financing doesn't actually channel to those economies very well. So one of the things that we want to look at is actually helping to mobilize capital to support the emerging economies, because they are hit the most and they struggle the most in terms of access to capital. That capital mobilization and flow isn't happening as much as it should, or the way it should. And I think now that we have digital applications, we can actually help to mobilize and track and monitor how those funds are actually utilized. For example, whether you're talking about aid or you're talking about investment, you want to understand where that money is actually going and where it's sitting. Today, if I ask most governments around the world to tell me how much, in the last 10 years, where that funding has gone exactly, it's very, very difficult for them to answer that question. But we need to change that moving forward, because we have actual applications and platforms that we've built that you can use to monitor and track every single penny that you're mobilizing to use, whether it's for DRR or it's for something else. You can measure that through the technologies. A good example, again, we refer to things like blockchain and smart contracts, right? With blockchain, you can track and monitor in real time, where things are going. You can track and monitor where is this funding going and how is it being spent, and it's all recorded on a digital application that every government around the world can actually look at and start to have a level of transparency. Because one of the challenges as well, especially when it comes to emerging markets and places like Africa, I hear a lot of investors saying to me, oh no, it's very risky, Michelle, I can't. It's very risky. But, that is kind of very inaccurate in a way. Yes, there's a level of risk, of course, and risk assessment has to be done. but actually, in actual fact, you don't have enough data, you don't have enough information about particular economies, so you perceive that it's extremely risky. And that's where the data stuff comes in. And finally, I mean, to give another example for us, I'm very, very passionate about inclusivity. I think you picked up on it a little bit. I think a lot of the economies that are hit hard, you find that, you know, it's usually the women and, you know, sort of the young people who are left to struggle with the challenges of DRR. So one of the initiatives that we've set up is actually the 10 Million Women Initiative, to support women to leverage, you know, technology, but also to provide them with access to capital through our funds, to help them to mitigate against the challenges that they face in every economy that they're in. Obviously, you know, tapping on tools like, you know, sort of artificial intelligence-based tools or blockchain application, but also simple things like just capacity building, education, awareness raising, right? Very, very important. Look at Rwanda. Rwanda, actually, I think every month, the president and the people within the community will go out and actually clean the country together, right? That is a very practical application in terms of helping to mitigate and actually monitor what's going on in the country. And finally, for me, I think when it comes to DRR as well, it's very much around, especially in terms of the mobilization of capital, right? It's very important that there are new forms of capital today. So I know we've talked a lot around the traditional financing, but now we have new forms of capital. When we're talking about digital finance or we're talking about digital assets, we talk about things like cryptocurrency. You know, we talk about, I know most people have probably heard about cryptocurrency and hacking, but actually crypto has a lot more to offer. And the blockchain-based application where crypto comes from can actually play a very significant role. So when you have things like, you know, refugee crisis or humanitarian crisis where you're not able to mobilize capital very easily, you can actually leverage on digital assets or digital tokens, which is what is backing, you know, cryptocurrency and things like that. So I also urge, you know, everybody in the DRR space to start to innovate around capital and start to look at new forms of capital, because there is a lot of capital lying around and we can really innovate and help to mitigate even the shortfalls in terms of capital. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And I think we could totally have this as a different panel talking about, you know, the risk assessments and also the data-informed decisions, right? And having more informed in order to reach the communities that we need, right? And, you know, usually talk about last mile, but, you know, I like to think about kind of last inch needs, right? It's like, how do we get there and really know, you know, what they need and plan with the community and not for them? And clearly, we're not going to talk about all of them today. The amount of financing mechanisms that are out there, and not every tool is going to be you know, helpful. It's not a silver bullet for everybody, but, you know, we need to continue to diversify our funding approaches. So, Marcos, your remarks, over to you.
Okay, yeah, you can hear me well. Well, I mean, from our side, as you can imagine, when we think of DRR financing and breaking silos, or as Tanjir was asking, what are we doing wrong? Automatically, we think of localization. We are a network of local organizations. We work with local communities. And of course, for us, it's about localization. Again, I hear a lot risk mitigation or how to avoid risk. And the main excuse for localization is about risk, avoiding risk. And I think it is important to bring to the conversation those success stories about how profitable and effective is localization. There is this research, I think it is from Peace Direct, that says that locally led interventions can deliver 32% more cost-effective programming. That means actual results. That means resilience. I just wanted to illustrate that with one of the projects that we've been running until 21st of January. But anyway, it's the same process that we've been implementing through other projects. But this specific project, locally led humanitarian solutions, I think illustrates beautifully what we mean when we speak about localization. Again, because localization is not just about localizing funding, localizing financing. It's about, as you said, Camila, it's about dialogue. And from our perspective, effectiveness again. So this beautiful project was implemented in 11 countries. It was about enhancing community resilience in regions, settings impacted by climate change and impacted by violence and conflict. So we are talking about Yemen, Iraq, those kind of countries. And the beautiful idea of it is that the project was, from the very beginning, implemented by the local organizations. So the first phase of the project was led by 11 local organizations working with local communities, and those 11 local organizations passing the experience and the knowledge to another 11 local organizations, working with some other communities, implementing their own solutions. So we are talking about reaching almost 200 communities. When I mean involving, I mean from the very beginning of the process. I was really happy when you talked about the 4Ds. The process, the methodology that we use is make sure that there is capacity strengthening of those local organizations at the very beginning of the process. Again, I'm saying capacity strengthening. Capacities are there, need to be strengthened. And starting from the organizational assessment to identify what are the aspects that need to be supported. Then, once you take that first step, you go for the local assessment. So at GNDR, years ago, we worked with this views from the frontline methodology, which is make a risk assessment in the community by the community. So it's not external consultant coming to tell what risks people are facing. So communities, their own, being able to assess their own risks. The next step, as you can imagine, is to support communities, these local organizations, supporting communities to design their own solutions after their own assessment. And of course, implement those solutions. We don't stop there. As you say, this is about dialogue. So the last part of the process is making sure that you can engage with local authorities and other stakeholders. So there is the policy component, again, locally led. Community owning that last step as well. What I mean is like, you have evidences there like that. When we speak about locally led initiatives, we know that local organizations have the capacity to mobilize communities to effectively lead those solutions for their own risks they are facing. Last thing, nobody said this was easy, okay? Of course, you have to face risks. Of course, it is demanding. But that's the way you make all those solutions sustainable, because communities and local actors, they really own the process. Yeah, I think that that example is pretty illustrative in that sense. And again, I think that breaking silos and making sure an effective DRR financing is about also localization, understood as locally led.
Thank you, Marcos. And great points. And I think part of that is how can we, in our respective roles, continue to find what are those mutually beneficial partnerships, right? And you talk about having that participatory design, model, right, where you can continue to have, that community ownership. I work with a partner in the U.S. and really talk about community-crafted resilient solutions, right? So the communities, right, on the ground, they know the community better than we do, right? And how can we tell them this is what you need? No, but if we work with them and they tell us what they need, then hopefully that funding and that implementation, when we talk about the 4Ds, right, from that diagnosis to the direction and the delivery, right, that implementation, and it's not going to work if we don't listen to them, right, in that whole process. And you talk about it today in your remarks earlier with the plenary. So I think there's a lot to unpack here from that perspective and that whole of society approach. But it's a two-way street, right, from public, private, civil society, everybody playing a role, but we can just talk about it, but we need to include them early and often in the process. And last but not least, Sarah, I'm gonna turn it over to you to provide some of your examples based on your perspective with UCLG.
Yeah, thank you, Camilla. So I'm Sarah, I'm coming from United Cities and Local Government, and we are the organization established by mayors and local government over the world. So the first point, I think, when we talk about local communities, sometimes it appears like if there is a donor and there are local communities. But of course, when we talk about government in the middle, we have not to forget that there are national, provincial and local governments. And what is the difference between a government, a local government and an NGO? Local government is accountable as government for all what is happening, or for example in financing is very often to ask to regulate so that fees can be charged, taxes can be collected, and the money should come back. So I think the role of local governments can never be underestimated. But of course the local government is not a merely implementer. A local government is very close to the community, is also able, of course, to gather the communities, to organize. I think the last 2 decades we have seen a big change in local governments doing participatory planning. There's a lot of work that was inspired by NGO sector, of course, but now it's done and institutionalized by local governments. So I think one first point is that local governments are the one who look at how can we be accountable. So if we look into private investment, we look into an investment that has to be paid back, and has to be paid back with interest. It comes from blockchain or from any other sources, but it is an investment that has to be paid back. And what is this investment then later tangible? How is it tangible? For example, Emma said, nature-based solution. Of course, a nature-based solution is a very always functional investment, but investment-wise, you can only do nature-based solution if somebody pays it back. So who pays it back and what does it cost? So a nature-based solution done by a development bank is extremely cost-intensive, while a nature-based solution done by a community in self-organized mechanism with a little bit of advice cost maybe 10%. But if you try to institutionalize this mechanism and fund it in a big funding window, then later also the poor communities have part of this to pay back. And that's why in London the nature-based solutions are mainly in rich neighborhoods, because they are very happy to invest and to pay back by the property taxes or whatever local government may charge them. So I think there is one point, this accountability. So that's also why it is very important to build capacity in local government to carefully select who is giving me the money and how, because the money of the market sometimes is available, of course, for many things, but why and how do I get this back? Who is covering me? How can I guarantee for what kind of investment? And here, of course, when we talk about what then happens with this money, nature-based solution is one part, but I think one of the very efficient ways of investment is in basic services. So, for example, a basic service, water supply, sewerage, street cleaning, and this 30% you mentioned are very, very clear if you have a very clean city where there's no garbage, so the garbage will not tap the tubes, and it will of course mitigate the risk enormously. And these basic services are a way, for example, quite feasible, because there is a financing mechanism in place, not necessarily the best or a working best, but there is in place. So I think what is very important is not to reinvent the wheel and to look where can I connect my activities to. So for example, in cities like Niteroi, they are very famous for disaster risk reduction, but not only, famous for climate change mitigation, famous for environmental policies. So they have done, of course, a whole job, because they just have done a governance reform, raising the data, having a good GIS system. But what is the argument? Why can I invest in a good system or in a good scenario system? Because I have later a better tax, because I can tax better, I can actualize all my data which I have, I can organize my own financing system. So I think that is the main point. The government's financing systems are also in local government very relevant, but if local government has no opportunity to take any decision because there is no decentralization, they have no autonomy, they have just to wait until somebody will in national government consider them, then of course nothing can happen. And I think here we have to go for, this is a little bit also our message in UCLG, that without autonomy, without participation of local leadership in national decision-making, in global decision-making, there is no, government cannot be reduced as implementer. I mean, they cannot take it over in these conditions. And I think, yeah, for the next step, for us, of course, it is here in disaster, the 2 points, integrating disaster and climate change into what public service are delivered, how can we strengthen them, how can we use these opportunities, and for the planning and for the strategies to reduce disasters, involve more local government. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Great insights, and you know, I echo and support everything you just mentioned, Sarah. And I really like that that perspective on agency, right, and having community ownership and the agency for our communities to help, you know, implement, not only design, be part of that process, but then really advise and be active, you know, agents of change. So, no, this is one of our last sessions, so we're going to now turn it over to you. We want to engage with our audience. We're going to use Slido, which we want to get some insights from your perspective to know where you're joining us from. So while I wait here to get, if you can, you know, go to slido.com and or scan this QR code and enter this. We'll be asking some questions. We also recognize that not everyone can or wishes to engage, so there will be also opportunities, you know, after the panel, or if you want to talk to a team member, if you have some insights to share. And there will be also an opportunity for you all to ask a few questions. So awesome. Okay, we already have some engagement. So again, you can join through slido.com enter that code, or you can scan the QR code. And our first question here is asking about where you're joining us from. We just want to know a little bit about what part of the world, and we know this is a global platform. Right now we have Colombia as the #1, well, kind of more of the trend in the middle. I'm from Colombia, so that's great to see other Colombians here, or a representation. I'm going to continue. We have the Philippines. We have local representation as well from Geneva. We have Switzerland, Belgium. I love it. We have London, Nepal, the UK. So every time you see in the middle, that's the main trend, the numbers, the highest kind of percentage of participation. So I'm going to give you a little more for those of you who haven't been able to participate. Continue to see a lot of representation: Uruguay, Barcelona, Japan, Egypt, the US. This is wonderful. Thank you all so much for being here, and here in Geneva. Can I give you a few more seconds to, if you haven't been able to, there's still always, it's going to stay on the left, to scan that QR code and tell us where you're joining us from. We have France. We have disastrous USA. Okay. Tempe, Arizona, Australia. Wonderful. I see a few more trying to enter. I'm going to give you a few more seconds. So after you're in, then it's going to be easier. All the questions, then you won't have to rejoin. Germany, we have Kenya, the DRC, Ireland, Bangladesh, Canada, Thailand, China. Wonderful. All right, well, you can continue to join for the next one. So we're going to move to the next question. One second. I think that we're going to the next shortly. All right, so here, which sector do you represent as well? I just want to know which sector are you representing today? NGO, government, private sector, academia, multilaterals, youth, community-based organizations, or other? Okay, right now we have civil society and NGO main represented right now. Okay, we'll continue to have government with 26%. Okay, pretty even. The other ones at the bottom. All right, more government at 26. All right, I'm going to give you a few more seconds here. Wonderful. We have a lot of NGO and civil society representation. 8% private sector. I know we're talking a lot about that and the role, and we have talked about the role of private sector and in those public-private partnerships. Okay. Still moving. Wonderful. We're going to go to the next question. And here, again, I don't want this to be, a long answer, just some initial reactions. What is that biggest challenge that you face in accessing or deploying DRR financing based on your experience from what you've seen, right? Is it political will, just very complicated eligibility criteria? What have you seen from your perspective for you or potential clients or people you work with, partners? US fund cuts, I know we're seeing some of that, funding gaps, political courage. What is that pipeline, right, of potential projects? Lack of political will, all right, we have that standing out. lack of technical assistance. Right now we have silos, which again is part of what we're talking about here. How do we break those silos, right? Uncertainty on value for money. Bureaucracy. Inadequate capacity. I know this is something that we continue to hear, time and time again with that local agency. And I think, Sarah, to your point, right, we can have that agency, but then you don't have the support to back some of those initiatives, and potentially through funding, it's really hard to implement, right, and try to have that capacity building. All right, I'm going to give you 10 more seconds, and we're going to go to the next question. And I know we also have participation virtually, so thank you all so much for joining us virtually. All right, next question. Thank you. And what's one innovation or solution that you have seen is helping break those financing silos in DRR? If you have seen any from your perspective, or you have read about it, or you have worked, or you're currently doing that, what do you think is something that has been innovative to help break those silos in the financing world for DRR? We really haven't talked much about here, but we see the early warning systems for all initiative, right? And I think, very ambitious targets that right now we have. By 2027, the goal is that every country in the world has multi-hazard early warning systems. So as of 2022, only half of the world population had multi-hazard, right? You can have for one hazard, but the goal is to diversify that. So I really like that here. We have knowledge sharing stakeholder groups, right? What we're doing here, are there any other platforms that we need to leverage? Approaching DR from a development perspective. Of course, we talked about PPPs, was, that's continued to really, how can we do that? Locally led solution, what is that political policy? Convincing ministers of finance, that's an interesting one, right? Talk about from the regulation standpoint, what are some things that we need to work there for the green bonds? Okay. All right. I'm gonna give you a few more seconds to enter. I love this. Again, this is gonna help us continue to work on a report and gather your insights and your perspective, and we'll continue to have opportunities to hopefully continue to engage throughout the platform. Wonderful, we have a lot of PPPs here. Okay, and then last question, we're gonna move forward, is here, what are the 2 priorities that you believe are most critical to transform DRR financing by 2030? As we talked about, there's a clear sense of urgency, right, with meeting the Sendai target. So what are these top 2? I know there are so many things that we can do, but what are some that you consider will be helpful? And if not, you can also share in the chat if you have other ideas that could really help us accelerate not only funding, but really meet those targets that, as we know, we're falling behind. So right now, with almost 60%, we have more political will and leadership and easier access to funding for local actors, which I think we do. I don't think it's a surprise here for our panelists from basically what we've talked about with some of those silos and difficulties accessing funding that is accessible and that really reaches the communities that need it the most. So far, it looks like those are our top 2. Our third one, scaled up private sector investment, which spot on with what we talked about, right? We need more private sector-led initiatives and having those mutually beneficial partnerships that can help us truly advance and work, through that whole of society, whole of community approach. And as we're here, all the stakeholders that we can include in the process. Alrighty. I think all of you already completed that. Well, thank you all so much for this portion. I'm going to take a few questions from the audience that based on what we just talked about, which ones you heard, even some of the answers that you even saw that you all provided. Are there any questions that you may have for our panelists? Anybody? Right here.
Thank you. Hi. So my question is directly to what was mentioned by Mr. Marcos from GNDR. So I understand the push for decentralization and localization, the fact that it can make responses much faster, more grounded, etc., etc. But what was mentioned on the two examples in Yemen and Iraq was quite concerning in a way, where governance is already fragmented. So doesn't prioritizing localization for DRR risks weakening national institutions even further? Could it unintentionally legitimize parallel systems, fragmented coordination, and undermine state building in the long run? Thank you.
Tough question.
Yeah, tough question, I guess. I said at the end, nobody said it was easy. I think this is a song from Coldplay, probably. But yeah, it's a really complicated process. And in that, in those settings or environments, any kind of initiative or financing is really complicated. Being honest to you, the last country in which we were about to operate and to implement this project was Yemen, because it was really, really much difficult. And I want to point out another aspect. And of course, I understand that the Yemen example is somehow extreme, but we are seeing in many other countries that the civic space is really shrinking. We see many other democratic governments approving new laws about foreign agents, focusing specifically on civil society movements and organizations, which really makes it more and more difficult to localize and to reach the local level. Again, I'm not saying that this is easy. I'm saying that this is a solution. I think that also responses from the audience were somehow clear. This is also about political will. And of course, with political will and the right instrument to put pressure in certain decision makers, in certain spaces or settings or regions, should focus on that as well. Again, I understand your question. I know it's not easy. We struggle many times to coordinate ourselves with our members because they are risking their lives. I know what you mean, but I think that this is also about a joint effort and make a good use of that political will.
Thank you, Marcos. Any other question? I think we saw on this side. Yeah, right here.
I can speak in French also. Je vais parler en français.
I do not. Does anybody? Do you do?
I don't speak French. You do?
Do you speak English too? Or no, we can also put our.
I have, my English is so.
Okay, no
bad.
problem. Yeah, I think we have here. 1 second.
Okay. Je suis Meshak
I am
Nakanyenge
Meshek Nakanyenge from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, member of the GNDR. In the DRC, for the years 2024-2025, we have experienced horrible floods in Kalehe, in the Kivu site, in Kinshasa, in the Kinshasa province, in Kalemi, in the Tanganyika province, in Alvira, in the Kivu Sites province, and Risiment in Ifizu, in the Kivu Sites, Akalima, and Kina in the Anyema province. The population has lost all of their investments without being insured at all. And right now, that very same population is in a very precarious situation. And right now, we can also add the conflict from the war that we are a victim of in the DRC and in my hometown of Goma at Kivu. In terms of localization, theoretically, we can say that international stakeholders are showing that localization is advancing, but those of us at the local level are not really seeing those advances in terms of localization. And in terms of governance, we are still at a very weak level. And maybe you know that in terms of our governments. And now I would like to know what is being done to actually help this population that is continuing to die every day and to lose all of their investments in terms of risk reduction of disasters and humanitarian localization to ensure the resilience that we ultimately need. Thank you.
I don't think if you all were able to hear. And thank you so much for your perspective, really talking about that localization, right? And also the impact of, we talk about fragile communities and also impacted by war right near the DRC. And really his question, I don't know who wants to take this here, give it a first crack at it, is, in terms of localization, and we talked a little bit about this, he hasn't really seen a lot of the impacts from those localized efforts in terms of funding, and they continue to lose funding, right? And what is being done, and what do you think can be done to help those communities that are actually not seeing that and continuously losing funding while also dealing with the proximity or being in war? So I don't know if anybody would like to start by answering this question. Marcos?
I'm just a quick intervention to also ask Sarah maybe to, I think, again, this is a joint effort. And again, communities are not accessing to that funding. And I think not just in those really complex settings, but in many other regular situations. So what I mean is a joint effort. The burden cannot be in those communities. And I think that somehow, I was mentioning, Sarah, how we can engage with local authorities, or how we can engage, and this is also my question, how can we engage with national authorities to make sure that conditions for that joint effort are over there?
Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Marcos. And I think the example you mentioned from DRC is clear. So we have two points. Maybe this was not addressed so clear, but there is a difference of humanitarian aid and development support. And this is I think a long story. Probably all of you have discussed this in parts, but if the future is that humanitarian aid is more seen as an investment, this means more, how can it lead to development, building back better? We call this, this was one of our slogans. It has to go through and with local governments, because local governments are the only actor that has a long term. Even if they are fragile, if there's corruption, if it is a weak system, but I mean, the system is also constructed when you implement, for example, an emergency or a rescue plan. So you build capacity by cooperating. And it's very important that the humanitarian sector engages with local governments, understanding, of course, there are certain gaps. So the gaps you were mentioning are many in local governments, but they are also the only ones who can really sustain, because they have an elected mandate, ideally. They have some budget and they have authority on decisions for future recovery and fund, so repayments, which is of course also important to explain to the community. It's not only we build back your house, but how is this financed? Where does the money come from? Will it be covered by tax? How does a country stay this? And I think that's very important when we look at the distribution also, because the local government, of course, have a mandate of distribution. So for them, every citizen is the same. You are rich or you are poor, and we have to take taxes and redistribute it, which is a simple system, of course. But on this redistributive part, I think the long-term investment is to ensure basic services to urban poor and to the poor citizens, and it's only possible if local government is also part of this financing, and in particular in fragile state. I know in Yemen we have, for example, cities and leaders that try to engage, and it's not easy because you're under stress, you want to act fast, you want to deliver, and you have I think you have other worries to lose your investment, but the local capacity is often in local government. You find engineers, you find economists, you find people who more or less can help you to take decisions. So I think here is an important way forward.
Thank you, Sarah. Michelle, you wanted to add something, please?
Yes, I did, because I wanted to address the gentleman's point around governance and accountability, because, you know, when you're in situations where maybe the government or the local, authorities are not necessarily trusted, I think this was to my earlier point in terms of what does the future look like. We need to provide mechanisms where we can show transparently where, for example, funding is going and where that funding is ending up, right? I think one of his points is very much around we're not feeling locally, the responses that maybe you hear about, right? So for us, it's important that you start to leverage applications that can be transparent and you can see, that we're getting responses or, funding or support. And you can monitor and track that, right? So you have accountability, whether it's local government who's doing it or private sector. In fact, this is a good example of where private-public partnerships come in very strongly and are needed very, very quickly, in rapid response, right? And I mentioned earlier on around what does the future look like. So for me, I think in scenarios like that, with the conflicts, whether it's in Congo, it's in Afghanistan or wherever it is, you need to find very quick responses. And one of the ways that you can do that is actually using new forms of capital. For example, you can give money to people who are struggling through maybe their mobile money. Africa uses a lot of mobile money. So we don't really have access to banking or anything like that, right? Sometimes you're in desperate situation, you're in refugee camps, you can't access the traditional mechanisms. You have to look at alternatives. But you also have to be quite accountable, right? And provide the data and the information as to how that funding was given. I think this is also back to the points that we've heard about from the US, where we've heard from the US, a lot of the complaints is that, look, we've been giving funding to a lot of economies, but there's no accountability on where that funding is going. How do we know that it's ending up to the right people? How do we know that aid is ending up to the people that actually need it the most at the time they need it? So I think it's very important to look at new ways and new mechanisms and new tools to support that level of transparency, which is really needed.
Thank you, Michelle. And I think that's part of how do you close that loop, right? Things that the intentions and the support, I mean, the difference between that response and now moving from response to recovery and rebuilding and, talk about build back better, right? And then it's how can we improve and sometimes not do things the same way that didn't necessarily work, but how to be a little bit faster with the approach, especially since a lot of these communities, and like you talked about, you can't continue to wait. You can't. If you say, well, just let's wait how things turn out, and they're just gonna laugh in your face, right? Like these are real pressing things that need to be changed now, right? Yesterday. And to your point, I think one of the questions we had from the audience virtually, I think Steve, we love your perspective here. It talks about why doesn't the funding agency X, right? We talk about World Bank, Asian Development Bank. provide a dedicated technical team when providing funding countries. I wonder what you've seen, how, if there's a case to do that, if there are cases, you know, from what you've seen, I thought that was an interesting, you know, perspective from that technical assistance when you're seeking funding, as we see that's been a challenge. So what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the question. I mean, from ADBs, I can't speak for all MDBs, but certainly for ADB, we do provide technical assistance in the design of projects. And we also provide technical assistance to address some of the barriers to accessing the capital markets for those countries that want to do that. I think where the challenge is, and I think where we also need to do more work, is on what they call bankable projects, right? So if you're not costing your DRM plans and you don't set out, you know, more than just your aspiration for resilient communities and all that good stuff, right? If it doesn't translate into projects, then it's very hard for banks to come in, because they are banks, to come in and fund it. So we've been providing technical assistance to countries to address some of those upstream issues. And then when we do have projects that countries want funding for, we then support from a technical perspective, the design, the feasibility of those projects. I'm not suggesting it's a simple situation. Countries have many development priorities. There's limited amounts that they can borrow. For the countries that are lower income and have restrictions because of debt distress, there's limited grants. And so it really comes to the question for the Ministry of Finance and for the government more broadly, you know, what their priorities are. Right. And if you don't have bankable DRM projects ready to go, then it's very hard, I think, for those sectors to make the case to the Ministries of Finance. And equally, when you want to access other pots of money outside of MDBs, it's also challenging. So somehow we need to address this disconnect.
Thank you, and to that point, I think this is another conversation again that we could spend a lot of time talking about this. One of the things we talked about earlier in another financing session was the regulatory and policy constraints too. So just not talking about multilateral and, you know, other funding agencies, but when you have private equity, right? I also, you know, Emma, I also share some of that sentiment, and, you know, I'm running a fund out of the US, which is a global fund. It's called the Community Disaster Resilience Fund, where we're trying to come in and invest in communities and work with jurisdictions, right? And invest. We have capital. We're saying we have, you know, floor. We're trying to invest $100 million up to $50 billion per project or cluster of projects. We say we want to invest in critical infrastructure. How can we make your infrastructure and more resilient, right? You have assets. Well, how can we help you, right? And we've had some challenges too with there is that desire to work with you and have that mutually beneficial cooperation, but then a lot of the legislature and the challenges that you have, they don't allow public-private partnerships. So what do you do, right? You have to get creative. And so if there's a need, but then you can't enter that, right? There are some of those constraints as well in that process. So that's another bucket, right? When you have, you know, great example from ADB that you do provide some of that. The ones that don't, how can they improve some of those mechanisms, right? And I think on that point, from the private equity perspective, curious, Emma, from your perspective from private equity, what are some of the, this is something related to one of our questions that we have online, but what role can particularly either clean energy and impact investors play in positioning DRR for private capital, right? We talk about making it appealing, and what is that role, especially since we trying to break down, you know, those silos, and as we know the government cannot do it alone, how can we leverage some of this funding, you know, mechanisms based on your experience?
Thanks. So I have been thinking about this, and I think there's three sort of many ways in which this could happen, but three things that those sectors, and specifically private investors, can input to be most helpful for resilience. And one is, as I mentioned data earlier, but data gathering and early response within that gives us more background as to what insured and uninsured losses will look like. Now that's that's a one-way street, but I think that road goes two ways. So the private sector has a huge amount of information, which it keeps private, which would enable us to provide more information, to have more information, a bank of data on uninsured losses, because nobody releases their uninsured losses. But if we provide a system where they can benefit from other people's data sharing and then provide data themselves, that I think would be a very helpful tool, and not only for the private sector. And I think the second is reframing disaster risk reduction as good business sense, so just good investing. And so it's something that we provide the technical report on. It's so that covers in detail, allowing the long-term modeling, allowing us to foresee what needs expenditure by when. And the IAB, the Investment Advisory Board for the UN DRR, has been putting together some principles for investors to sort of follow, to get them thinking about this when they're looking at new assets for a portfolio. And that is very helpful in the sense that I don't think it says anything which is life-changing, but it focuses the mind on resilience. It forces investors to see this as something which is critical, changing rapidly, and which they haven't got all the information on. And the third is design back and then invest into financial innovation that addresses this kind of thing. So we have put forward in the Investment Advisory Board a couple of products which respond to resilience, but one, I mean, if you don't have, we have two options, I guess, for financing resilience, because it doesn't have a revenue attached to it. So you either attach your resilience to a present asset already and attach it to that development or that business which is already running, that's nature-based infrastructure. But as Sarah says, somebody has to pay for that. So if you don't have an asset, if you don't have a platform, an infrastructure base that is already there and can therefore already sort of put in place the mechanism to socialize the cost, then you have to socialize the cost of that infrastructure in another way. And that is another product that we're putting together, looking at how we can socialize the cost of potentially extremely expensive resilience assets amongst governments using effectively an insurance policy or a monoline insurance policy. So a credit enhancement, which would allow people to socialize cost of some very localized problems amongst a huge, ideally global base.
Thank you, Emma. Yeah, thank you. And I think you touched on really good points, and we also had another question from our virtual participants, which I think, again, it's an interesting question and a tough one as well for that political will, and that we actually saw from all of you when you participated in Slido, that he talked about how do you increase that political will and that buy-in from our governments as well, right? And I think part of that, I think also setting up a number and that cost-benefit analysis and what is that return on investment, and saying, well, what do we need to engage here, right? Why does this make sense? It's part of that equation. And you talk about more risk-informed decisions, data-driven solutions. That's part of all the buckets, right? There's just not one thing, and everything is going to work differently for different countries and different communities. Some are going to may have more initiatives that are making more advancements or more progress. So it's not going to work for everyone. But I think those are important things to think about. We have another question from the audience. I saw back then. Thank you. Yes, the gentleman in the back.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Hello. Very quick, conscious of time. So I used to work for a company called Rio Tinto, then Holcim, and I was their chief resilience officer. And now I've started my own business trying to promote what we call resilience adaptation. The challenge I have, or we have, is how do we connect the private sector with the government and the UN? So currently, I'm supporting it's called the Corporate Chief Resilience Officer of the UN. And what you said, guys, is absolutely brilliant. I just hope somehow it will go to the CEO's ears of a multinational company. Because the missing link with what the gentleman told us in the RC is the corporation investing to make sure that whatever how much they generate into the nation as actually part of the EBITDA they're making is then giving back to the society. It can't always be the government stepping in, it has to be them. And one of you said earlier, they need to, in French there's a sense which says, le pollueur paye. Whoever pollutes has to pay. Well, how do we make them pay? How do we find the funding so that we can help the local community? So it's a long question for an even longer answer on your side, but how can we break those silos? How can we bring back the money down in what we call the locus of manifestation, where it actually happened? It doesn't happen in the HQ in the beautiful headquarters, it happened on the ground. So how can we break that silo?
Anybody wants to take a stab at it? Do you have a comment or connected to? Sure.
Thank you. I'm Angelika Planitz from UNDP based here in Geneva, and actually it's a follow-on comment, and that relates to not political will, but political economy. And I think we are talking a lot about incentives, and I love this thing about make resilience an investable target, but at the same time we know that risk is increasing. So there are still many people out there that benefit from risk creation, and they transfer that risk, the cost of the risk, to other people, other locations, vulnerable groups in remote locations. So the thing is, what does the panel have to say to overcome that barrier? Thank you. It's also not an easy question.
Thank you. I want to be mindful of time. Does anybody want to add anything to? I know there's a lot to unpack into your comment. I mean, there's a lot that we can share there. I know, Marcos, you made some comments there, but does anybody else, any other thoughts about how to break those silos to his both of their comments? Michelle, you want to? And then we're going to wrap it up.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up a bit on how to break the silos, because I think sometimes you find that government and private sector, I'm in the private business myself, but I used to work for UK government, right? So for me, I think it's also about governments, one, talking to one another, sharing data, sharing information, sharing best practice. It doesn't happen enough, right? And private sector, engaging private sector, when you know that you cannot fix something, it's very highly likely that somebody in the private sector actually has a solution, but also needs your support. Another example, like I said earlier on, we also have now, for example, fintechs and different providers of capital and access to capital. The second thing that everybody mentioned was a challenge was access to finance. We have new forms of finance. You've got, sort of fintechs and other new providers, right, who want to work and provide that financing, but they don't have access to the market or they don't have access to the customers. But government has a lot of that data. So for me, it's also about sharing and starting to really, connect. Government, intergovernment needs to connect. Government and private sector need to connect. Government and new players need to connect. So I think it's about making sure that we can get everybody to start to talk to one another and actually share information and especially data. If you're starting to share data, most of the risk perception comes from, I don't think I have enough information here for me to make a very well-informed decision, whether I'm going to invest or not invest. Highly depends on data most of the time. So I think the data element is very important.
Thank you, Michelle. And to just close this session, I know we have so much more to talk about. I'm going to ask our panelists, very brief, 15 seconds. What are, last reflections to close from your remarks? A bold action or recommendation that you think we need to prioritize this year. Sarah, I'm going to start with you. I'll keep it very brief. Some final thoughts, please.
Yeah, actually, I was also to answer to the gentleman on the global private sector on one part, mining industries, for example, and there was now a court decision, I think in Germany, to RWE, the big electricity company, to pay for damages they have done in Peru. And it was a long chain of decision, but of course, this kind of judgments and of court decisions only happen if there is a lot of awareness and if you have voters who want this to go. So I think it's a little bit play the ball back. UN is not talking a lot about political economy and about mining sector, for example, which is in DRC one very important point to talk about. So there are examples. Another example, Colombia with regalias, that is working. It is institutionalized, but it is often not used because there is not enough auditing and there's not enough knowledge about it. So that's one part. But my message also was on private sector, not to forget the big difference between the global private sector, which here was mainly addressed, and the local private sector. So I think one point, as you were saying, Michelle, if you talk about mobile and sending quick money in the moment, this is really very interesting because so many is happening when you give funding to those who have always been able, shop holders, small sector, the local economy will stay in the territory and they will do, of course, whatever they can and they will invest first locally. So I think that private sector is not the same we talk about, but it should also be included.
Thank you, Sarah. Marcos, very brief.
Brief.
One sentence.
I think, and I'm not, yeah, I think somehow also trying to add a bit of, trying to respond to that question, which is, again, really complicated, complex aspects. But I think it's a matter of building a different framework. And I think in terms of relationships, and I think when Emma was saying, when speaking before about reshaping how we, I think it's a matter of that. We need to make sure that there is a different framework for us to build those relations. And of course, in building that framework, it has to be an accountability towards communities. And in that framework, there has to be a space for communities to make sure that they are part of the conversation and they are part of the decision making. Again, linking that to effectiveness and ownership.
Thank you, Marcos.
Basically,
I'm gonna cut you there. I know, Michelle, you provided, the importance of data. I know you I took those as some of your final remarks. Emma, I'm gonna turn it over to you very quickly, and Steve.
Okay, thank you.
One sentence. I know they're just very concise.
Okay, I think a bold, concrete action that we could take would be to embed resilience into the core of national, multilateral, and private sector investing. And that, of course, involves the political will that we were talking about earlier, and also the understanding and the data for private sector investors. But I think resilience broadly must become part of how investors see value.
Steve?
Sure. I guess I'll just repeat myself. Develop DRR investment plans at the sector level that will guide multilateral and other development finance and sends a signal to the private sector.
Well, thank you all so much, and definitely want to encourage you all, if you haven't done so already, depending on where you work, where you live, just try to get to know who are the players that you haven't engaged with before, right? Who are those partners? Try to build those relationships early, so then when disaster strikes, if there's a need, that you know who to call, and you already built some of that. And I think all of us, all our panelists, thank you so much for your remarks. I know we could definitely spend so much time talking about so much more, and really reminder that resilience is not a luxury, right? But it's a necessity, and that we need to act boldly and now. And thank you all again, and we'll look forward to collaborating with you all throughout the conference and the platform. And I hope you have a great rest of your evening. Thank you.